Racialism, sometimes called scientific racism, is the pseudoscientific belief that groups of human beings are inherently biologically different from each other based on different evolutionary paths that have carved up the species into different races that are distinct enough from each other to make interbreeding undesirable and cultural exchange a potentially dangerous hazard. Said another way, racialism posits, using all sorts of outdated and misinterpreted scientific understandings, like determining intelligence based on the shape of a person's skull, that black people and white Europeans and folks from Asia are different enough, which is an idea also called polygenesis, that they should stay in their own parts of the world, and that by separating everyone out according to presumed racial background, we would all be able to do as we like based on our own alleged cultural guide rails and in accordance with our own alleged biological destinies, which in some cases would mean invading and killing and maybe even enslaving the other inferior, in our minds at least, races. But in the polite, political telling of this concept, it usually means something like putting up walls to keep out the racially inferior riffraff, so they don't pollute our good and pure and obviously superior bloodlines. Important to note is that different people with genetic lineages from different parts of the world do tend to have distinct collections of biological traits, ranging from skin tone to height to propensities for or defenses against various sorts of disease. There's actually no clean line between groups of people the way this theory says, though. Race, the way the word is used today, references a collection of qualities that tend to be found within different groups of people, but every person is a unique collection of genetic mutations and variations and experiences and influences and beliefs and ideas and everything else. And the old school concept of biological race has not held up to modern scientific scrutiny. It's mostly a cultural concept at this point, and even then it's a fairly fuzzy one. That said, a lot of very smart people used to believe in the racialism concept back in the Enlightenment era, from around the mid-1600s to the late 1700s, as science back then was beginning to help us delineate between all sorts of species and giving us a hint of the more complete evolutionary understandings that would arrive the following century. But as with many fields of inquiry, this initial glimpse granted us as much new confusion, masquerading as insight, as it did actual novel and real understandings. Today, this concept is almost exclusively cleaved to by folks belonging to various racial supremacist groups, including but not limited to those who are part of the so-called Identitarian Movement, which is a far-right European nationalist ideology that spans many countries and political organizations, and which aims, among other things, to significantly truncate or end globalization, to do away with multiculturalism in all its forms, to combat what this group sees as the spread and influence of Islam across Europe, and to significantly limit or even completely end immigration of people from outside of Europe into European nations. Folks and parties that subscribe to this ideology are often considered to be ultra-conservative and also sometimes xenophobic and racist, racism being distinct from racialism, as racialism posits that there are different hard-coded biological racial realities that cleanly delineate one group of humans from another, while racism tends to be the belief that one group of people is superior to another, with folks who are racist at times acting upon that belief in various ways. The Identitarian Movement is officially categorized as a right-wing extremist group by the German intelligence agency, and the Southern Poverty Law Center considers a slew of groups that align with this movement to be hate groups. Though based on the writings and principles of earlier thinkings and politicians, this group is actually fairly modern, only coming into being in its current incarnation in the early 2000s, though the collection of ideas and efforts that informed this movement arose in France in the 1960s as part of a neo-fascist effort to inject out of vogue extremist ideas into respectable, evolving post-World War II political debate. This was essentially an effort to rebrand Nazi ideology so as to make it seem smart and with it in the still stunned but rebuilding European idea marketplace. And its primary innovation was taking some of those fascist and racialist concepts and hiding them under the more palatable label of nationalism, which was experiencing a resurgence following the wave of multiculturalism that began to flourish after the war, though not without imperfections and conflict. One of the most popular elements of this ideology, though, was introduced a fair bit later, in the early 2000s and 2010s. Remigration refers to the idea that liberals, people on the left side of the political spectrum, want to replace good, hardworking, morally correct white French people, and later this idea was expanded to encompass all white Europeans, with folks from other countries, especially Muslim majority countries, but also other places where folks don't tend to be white. These lefties are keen to do this for a variety of reasons, apparently. But one of the most popular claims is that they want to give handouts to these new arrivals and thus get their votes, capturing the government forever by slowly reducing the overall population of the good, wholesome white locals in order to outpopulate them with new arrivals, whose votes will forever be captured by the politicians who gave them all those handouts. Sometimes called the Great Replacement Theory, this idea serves as justification for the aforementioned increasingly popular concept of remigration, which basically means rounding up everyone who's living in Europe but not originally from Europe and shipping them elsewhere, even if they are citizens of where they're living in Europe, and even if they are not citizens of the countries they are being shipped to. Some versions of this idea also say that the descendants of immigrants, folks who were born in their European homes, not elsewhere, should also be shipped back to where their grandparents or great-grandparents came from due to a lack of sufficient assimilation, which means taking up the culture of the place you've moved to. But in this case, which usually serves as a stand-in for has a different faith, likes different food, adheres to different norms, and other multiculturalism-linked distinctions. This rounding up and shipping would be based on the person's supposed racial identity, not their national identity. So in a way, this concept is a means of smuggling racialism into politics by making it seem as if the modern way of organizing the world and its people, that of nation-states, and those nation-states granting an identity, a national origin to its people, is not inherent or ideal, and that we should instead force people to stay where we believe other people like them, according to our understandings about such things, originally came from, and where they thus belong. That underlying concept is not one that's taken seriously by most scientists or philosophers or demographers or sociologists or anyone else whose profession is linked to this collection of ideas, but it's proven to be a useful narrative and justification for folks who feel as if they're becoming strangers in what they consider to be their homeland, their culture, their city, and so on. And that's made it a useful point of leverage for traditionalist and conservative political parties across Europe, and increasingly, in recent years especially, elsewhere around the world as well. What I'd like to talk about today is a party in Austria that has leaned heavily into this collection of ideas and which claimed the most votes in the country's recent election as a consequence. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. The Freedom Party, or FPO, is an Austrian political party that's a founding member of the European Scale Identity and Democracy Party, which recently merged with other fellow traveler parties from the Czech Republic and Hungary to become the Patriots for Europe group, though all of these entities share roughly the same ideological platforms and practical political ambitions. And among those ambitions is the desire to tackle the issue of immigration across the European Union, reducing especially the number of people coming into the bloc from Muslim-majority nations, which large numbers of people in many European countries have complained about, usually because they feel the cultures of their hometowns and home countries are changing rapidly. And as a result of that, they feel like they are being elbowed out and replaced by these newcomers who have very different sets of beliefs and behaviors from their own. This is not a new complaint, and this is not only a European thing. Across history, even very modern history, when a wave of immigrants arrives in a new home, that can make the people who were there before them feel like they are under assault And if those new arrivals have a different religion than the majority of the people in the place they've immigrated to, that can increase the perceived differences and threats, as can a difference in skin color, the clothing they wear, cultural customs, foods, fragrances, language, and just about anything else. This angle of politicking has become increasingly popular with mostly but not exclusively conservative parties around the world in recent years, though, as some of those parties have gotten pretty good at spreading this message to disaffected people, including disaffected youths in some of the most immigrated to places in the world. So young men in the United States, for instance, according to recent polls, have been hearing a lot about this and seem to be open to the idea that some of the, on average at least, issues that they seem to be facing in terms of educational attainment, employment options, and other such things, these are the fault of these new arrivals. And that's possibly a component of the gender-skewed shift we are seeing in the lead up to November's US presidential election, with young people in general leaning liberal, but more young men leaning conservative than young women. That's almost certainly not the only issue at play here, of course, but it is something conservative politicians in the US seem to be leveraging, even to the point that former president and current Republican candidate Donald Trump recently mentioned the term remigration in a social media post, something that's being seen by political analysts as a sort of trial balloon to see if the concept might be picked up by folks in his political orbit and might in turn garner him more support amongst people who feel like too many immigrants are entering the United States, and that all that immigration is bad for one of several possible and well-promoted reasons. Maybe this trial balloon implies we should just ship them all back to where they came from, and that may then free up housing and jobs and maybe set things back to normal, the wonderful way things used to be. It's worth noting that the word remigration was initially used to refer to the return of European Jews to their homes after World War II, but it was adopted by French white nationalists in the mid-2010s to allude to deporting immigrants and the children of immigrants en masse. The term became more widely known after an investigation found that in late 2023, members of the Alternative for Germany, or AfD party, had a secret meeting with neo-Nazis, at which there was a presentation by a 30-something far-right Austrian political activist named Martin Sellner, who, among other things, is the leader of the Identitarian Movement that I mentioned in the intro. And in that talk, he supported the idea of a program that would involve identifying and removing minorities of various kinds from Germany by force. Remigration, basically, a topic that he has also written a book about. Sellner later said that his words were twisted by the media and that remigration is really just a collection of policies that would slow or stop some types of immigration in the future. But he was banned from Germany because of that talk, until a German court revoked that ban last May, and he was denied entry into the UK in 2018 and into the US in 2019 because of a large donation he received from the mass shooter who attacked 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, killing 51 people and injuring 89. Sellner himself has said that until 2011 he was a neo-Nazi, and his wife, an American pro-Trump online influencer, who was a big proponent of the so-called Pizzagate conspiracy theory, among other notable and demonstrably false narratives that became popular in the lead-up to previous elections. She spread a lot of the same content, but with a US bent rather than a European one. Both Sellner's and other members of the Identitarian Movement have been accused of parroting Nazi talking points, promoting things like Holocaust denial, and calling for minorities to be mass executed. But they generally contend that they're simply proud nationalists who love their countries and don't want to see them changed or ruined by a bunch of people from other places with different ideas and beliefs and priorities, coming in and taking all the jobs and tweaking everything to suit their wants and needs against the desires of those who were there first. The concept of remigration has attained popularity at a more rapid rate in some places than others, and it seems to have done especially well in Austria. The country's Freedom Party won 29% of the vote in the country's last election in late September of this year, and that was the highest tally of all the parties that participated, which is notable in part because of what the Freedom Party believes now in terms of remigration and adjacent policies, but also because this is a party that was founded in the 1950s by a former SS officer and Nazi politician. It is expected that the Freedom Party won't be able to form a government because every other party has said they won't form a coalition with them. The currently governing Conservative People's Party has said that they might be open to it, but not with Herbert Kickl, the group's current leader, involved in the resultant government. Kickl is an ardent ally of Russian President Putin, has been accused of attempting to meld right-wing populism with Nazi-valenced fascist extremism, a common accusation against folks in this corner of the political spectrum, though in some cases an accusation that is also seemingly true. Like Sellner and other folks with this ideological orientation, Kickl promotes the idea of remigration, which in the context of Austrian politics, in his mind at least, would help reinforce the strength of a theorized fortress Austria, with completely closed borders and which is run by an all-powerful security state apparatus that is capable of managing those borders and keeping the peace inside the nation's impermeable walls. Kickl has said in the wake of the election in which his party was victorious that Austrian politicians are making a decision by excluding his party, and him specifically, from government. That is a slap in the face to the electorate, though he has continued to make overtures to other conservative parties in the hope that they might be willing to work with the Freedom Party to form a functioning government. This seems unlikely at this point, though it's not impossible. Even without a functioning coalition, though, Kickl and his party's win at the polls, bringing in the most support of any party, speaks volumes about the popularity of this general collection of concepts and ideas. And the same seems to be true in many other countries where these ideas are being spread. Despite a few letdowns for European far-right parties in recent years, this collection of political entities and personalities have done pretty well over the past decade, making substantial gains in France, Germany, and the Netherlands in particular. That these parties often align themselves with fascist governments and subscribe to easily disproven conspiracy theories does not necessarily outweigh their support of increasingly popular anti-immigration policies, it would seem. And that popularity seems to be the result of their success in tying immigration to all manners of social and economic ills. Much of Europe is still experiencing economic downswings, high levels of inflation, and overall underperformance compared to their wealthy global peers post-pandemic peak. So this sort of messaging may be decently well received even by folks who would not typically agree with much of the rest of their platform or narrative, but who are currently looking for anything that defies the current status quo and anyone who provides something that seems like it might be an explanation for those many and varied downswings and other perceived ills. The book I'd like to recommend today is The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley. This book is a fun novel. It includes time travel, but to me, the thing that really stood out was the character development. The characters are a lot rounder and imperfect in interesting ways than you tend to see in what we might call speculative genre fiction. And it's the interaction between them and their fears and foibles and everything else that, to me, make up the most compelling portions of the narrative. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.